I'd like to talk to you just for a few minutes and make this informal. I love the dialogue or the question and answer if there's comments or opinions that you have. But just to get us started off this morning, to talk about what we are here discussing this week in the Reuse and Rebuilding Conference, and also related to what's going on in Youngstown, Ohio, which is a city similar to Buffalo on a smaller scale, but a city that is going through what many of our Great Lakes cities are going through. We often hear the term Rust Belt, and I just get so tired of that term. But when you talk about the Cleveland and Detroit or New York or even Pittsburgh or Erie, or many of these cities share some similarities. But just to start off maybe with a few comments, and then we'll get to some slides to show you some consistency, and then again I'd like to end it up with Q&A or dialogue or discussion. I won't be before you very long. But it was in 1962 that President John F. Kennedy said in his State of the Union address that we will neglect our cities at our peril, because when we neglect our cities, we neglect our nation. And I think that it is inarguable that for the past 8 to 10 years, there has been a very tragic neglect of the cities of the United States of America, and particularly cities like Buffalo, like Cleveland, like Detroit, like Youngstown, Ohio. Cities that were once industrial power bases that has seen a precipitous population decline that has led to the slum and the economic struggles that we've experienced over the past decade. Not only has that happened just as a result of the post-industrial boom, but if New York or some of these other states are anything like the state of Ohio, there's actually been a great deal of hostility toward the cities. There's been state and federal policies that have not only facilitated urban sprawl and exacerbated, but they've actually been hostile to cities when we try to do things to revitalize ourselves and try to have policies that would assist our core cities. However, I think it's also undeniable that cities have always had a certain mystique, a certain innovativeness, and a certain resilience. Cities, despite what we're going through, still tend to attract people such as we have here today at this conference who want to see them at their best. I'm extremely encouraged by the change in administration in Washington, D.C., not for partisan reasons, but because I believe now that there will be an administration in Washington, D.C. that has a sensitivity to and an understanding as to what's been going on in our cities, particularly with President-elect Obama. It was interesting that he was at some points derided throughout the campaign for being a community organizer on the south side of Chicago. But as I travel through the south side of Youngstown or the south side of Buffalo or the south side of Cleveland, there are a lot of similarities that hold with the south side of Chicago. So to me, I think it's an exciting prospect to have someone at the top of the federal policy agenda that has a sensitivity to what's going on the south side of any one of those cities or any side of those cities that we have here in this country. It's also interesting or ironic that the national economic crisis that is now sweeping the country has brought new attention to the plights of Buffalo and New York and Buffalo and Cleveland and Detroit and Youngstown. And my sarcastic side of me wants to be a little bit cynical and say, well, you know what, I'm glad that they're finally feeling a little bit of the pain, this panic and this crisis. I tell them, well, welcome to a day in the life of Youngstown, Ohio. So, where they've been now sort of feeling this for the past 18 to 24 months, there are cities who have experienced this for 10, 15, 20, and 30 years. So I'm not happy that others are experiencing this pain, but I think it also makes the case that cities that are here today or represented here today or communities that are represented here today for a long time have been saying that it's important that we have an agenda, it's important that we have a focus to make sure that these cities are able to sustain themselves and able to survive. So unfortunately, again, it's taken a national economic crisis, but I think we are slowly but surely seeing a national and hopefully statewide agendas that will align up and be consistent in assisting us with the things that we're here to discuss. This is a conference about addressing issues of vacancy and abandonment and the decline in our neighborhoods and adaptive reuse. And all those things are important. The topics that you'll discuss this week: recycle the center, restore the center, and act and initiate. However, it's important to understand these things in a much broader context, because the other issues that are going on in our cities are going to affect the things that we're talking about here this week: restoring, recycling, acting, and implementing. And to that degree, I want to talk a little bit about Youngstown, Ohio, because Youngstown, Ohio is representative or reflective of many of the communities, if not all of the communities that are represented here today. It's smaller than Buffalo, it's smaller than Detroit, it's smaller than Cleveland, larger than some of the other cities. but the challenges that we face in Youngstown, Ohio are going to be identical or very similar to the challenges that we're facing and the challenges that we're going to discuss here today. The industrial boom and fall of Youngstown, Ohio is not dissimilar to many other cities that we're going to be talking about. The city of Youngstown at its height in the 50s and 60s was 170,000 people. The city was at one point the third largest steel producing region in the entire country. The population of the city was expected to exceed 200,000. The city was geographically laid out to accommodate 250,000 people. Well, that all changed in September of 1977, and it's still referred to as Black Monday in the city of Youngstown, where Youngstown Sheet and Tube closed its doors, and in the subsequent 3 to 5 years, over 30,000 high-paying manufacturing jobs were lost. In effect, the city lost its identity, the city lost its heart and soul, and it created a vacuum and a void. And into that void stepped a lot of negative things: socioeconomic decline, crime, a whole host of things. And this population of the city today stands at about 80,000. So imagine a city that was once 175,000, now at 80,000, and again, it was laid out to accommodate 250,000 people. There is a lot of excess everything, a lot of excess infrastructure, a lot of excess housing, a lot of excess slum and blight, just a lot of excess of everything. Well, over the course of the years, the city went through a series of reinventions and just grasping at straws and coming in and buying into any philosophy that a snake oil salesman or a traveling salesman would come in and say, no, this is going to fix Youngstown. This is the cure to Youngstown. As a matter of fact, one of the ones that was not too long ago, I traveled here by plane, as I'm sure many of you did, some of you did, some of you drove. But there is an airport in Youngstown that Youngstown used to own, and a manufacturer came in and said, you know what? We've got it. This is what's going to put Youngstown back on a map. We are going to manufacture blimps at the Youngstown airport. Now, I don't know about you, but I've not traveled via blimp lately. And this was post-Hindenburg. So even after the Hindenburg disaster, they were going to come in and build blimps in Youngstown. And the people bought into it. The community said, okay, hey, you're going to build blimps. And as you can probably imagine, the blimp factory, no pun intended, never took off the ground. But it just was indicative of the state that the community was in, just grasping and listlessly drifting without an identity, without a purpose, and certainly without a vision and an agenda. It was back in the late 90s, early 2000s that finally, to a certain extent, the city had hit rock bottom. And assuming that you don't give up, once you hit rock bottom, there's only one way to go, and that's up. The city started reviewing what other communities were doing. There was a city, Chattanooga, Tennessee, that was going through a process called Chattanooga 2000. It was a visioning and planning initiative that Chattanooga was undertaking that we found some promise in, and we began to follow a similar vision. And basically the process was one that engaged multiple stakeholders in the city of Youngstown. Not just your traditional leaders, but the citizens, the grassroots, the nonprofits, the businesses, the educational institutions, in a series of community meetings that were ultimately culminating in a meeting on a cold December night back in 2002. Now, Youngstown had become very cynical and very critical, so understand that there weren't a whole lot of people who were believing that this process was going to lead to anything. Well, on a cold December night, about a week and a half before Christmas, 1,300 people showed up at one of the historic auditoriums in downtown Youngstown and stayed for 3 hours to talk about the future of the community. And in those 3 hours, and we'd only scheduled it for about an hour and a half, but people ultimately stayed for 3 hours, 1,300 people, and in a community like Youngstown, that was absolutely mind-boggling, because not only was it the folks from Youngstown, it was the folks from the suburbs, and the folks from the outlying regions coming in to talk about reshaping a future agenda for this entire community.